I always believed Amelia and I had a rock-solid marriage. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but who doesn't after 10 years? We had a rhythm, work, shared dinners, occasional vacations, and quiet evenings where she'd curl up with her marketing plans while I buried myself in spreadsheets. But everything changed the night she sat me down at the kitchen table. It was one of those quiet evenings. The kids were at her mother's place for the weekend, and the house was almost eerily silent. She seemed nervous, tapping her nails against her coffee mug, a nervous tick of hers that I hadn't seen in years. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice trembling ever so slightly. My stomach twisted. Her eyes wouldn't meet mine. For a moment, my mind raced through possibilities. Had someone died? Was she sick? But nothing could have prepared me for what she said next. "I've been having an affair." My brain couldn't process her words at first. I just stared at her, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the silence of the room. She spoke quickly, like ripping off a Band-Aid, desperate to blurt it all out before her courage failed her. "It's been 3 months, with Nathan," she admitted. Nathan. A name I knew too well. He was the business consultant who had been working with her marketing firm, a man whose name had come up in her stories about work more times than I could count. I thought nothing of it. He was just a colleague, or so I believed. "Why?" I managed to croak out, my voice foreign even to my own ears. The word hung between us, loaded with anger, confusion, and heartbreak. Amelia's eyes finally met mine, brimming with tears. "I felt lonely," she whispered. "You've been so distant, always focused on work." I started to feel invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. Her words cut deeper than any knife could. My own shortcomings laid bare, mingling with the betrayal. But still, I couldn't wrap my head around it. Feeling neglected was one thing, but to go to someone else? To Nathan, of all people? "Did you love him?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "It wasn't about love. It was stupid, impulsive. I didn't think about what I was doing. I slammed my hand down on the table, making her flinch. "You didn't think? You didn't think about me, about the kids? About what this would do to us?" My voice cracked, and I hated the vulnerability in it. She sobbed, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I wanted to comfort her, to take her in my arms and tell her it would be okay, but I couldn't. Not now. Not after this. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage, searching for signs I had missed. Amelia stayed in the bedroom, the door locked. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. Over the next few days, the truth unraveled in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Amelia didn't just confess to the affair, she revealed details that felt like daggers to the heart. She had met Nathan at a work conference, where a late-night brainstorming session turned into drinks at the hotel bar. She described the pull she felt toward him, how his attention made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. I learned that their trysts had taken place in the very city where we had spent our honeymoon. The irony was bitter and cruel. She claimed it wasn't about the sex, but the emotional connection. "He listened to me," she said. "He made me feel seen." Those words haunted me. Had I truly failed her so deeply? Or was this just an excuse to justify her actions? Amelia agreed to cut off all contact with Nathan, but the damage was already done. Every time her phone buzzed, I wondered if it was him. Every late meeting or business trip became a source of suspicion. I started checking her phone when she wasn't looking, something I had never done before. I hated myself for it, but the need to know was overpowering. And then one day, I found something I wasn't meant to see. A draft email she had written to Nathan, unsent but damning nonetheless. In it, she apologized for ending things so abruptly and admitted she still thought about him. It felt like a slap in the face, a betrayal on top of a betrayal. Confronting her about the email led to one of the worst fights of our marriage. She accused me of not trusting her, of not giving her a chance to make things right. I threw her words back at her, accusing her of not truly wanting to fix our marriage. We yelled, cried, and said things that could never be unsaid. In the weeks that followed, we went to counseling. I wanted to try for the kids' sake, if nothing else. But every session felt like peeling back a scab, exposing raw wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. Amelia spoke about feeling like she was drowning in the monotony of our life, while I admitted my own failings, how I had taken her for granted, assuming she would always be there. Despite our efforts, the cracks in our marriage only seemed to grow wider. Trust was a fragile thing, and mine had been shattered. Every time she touched me, I wondered if she had touched him the same way. Every time she said she loved me, I questioned its sincerity. The worst part wasn't the anger or the heartbreak. It was the doubt. Doubt in her, in myself, in the very foundation of the life we had built together. Could we ever move past this? Or was this the beginning of the end? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, our marriage would never be the same again. The days following Amelia's confession were a blur of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. My trust in her had shattered, and with it, the foundation of everything I thought we had built together. The nights were the worst, lying awake on the couch, haunted by images of Amelia and Nathan together. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and hostile. But nothing gnawed at me more than the seed of doubt that had been planted deep in my mind. Was our youngest child even mine? Emma was 4, a bright-eyed whirlwind of energy with Amelia's smile and an infectious laugh that could light up a room. But now, every time I looked at her, that doubt crept in. I hated myself for even entertaining the thought, but the betrayal had twisted my perception of everything. What if Amelia's affair wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment? What if Nathan had been around longer than she claimed? It started as a whisper in the back of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. I tried to dismiss it, to push it down, but the suspicion was relentless. The timing of Amelia's affair and Emma's birth overlapped in ways that made my stomach churn. I began to analyze Emma's features obsessively, searching for signs of Nathan in her face. It was ridiculous, I knew that, but the doubt refused to let go. One night, after the kids had gone to bed and Amelia was holed up in the guest room, I finally confronted her. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as I entered, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, as if she thought I was coming to forgive her. But that hope vanished the moment I spoke. I need to know if Emma is mine, I said, my voice flat and cold. Amelia's eyes widened in shock, and she recoiled as if I had slapped her. What are you talking about? She whispered, her voice trembling. You heard me, I said. I want a DNA test. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head vehemently. Liam, how can you even ask me that? Of course she's yours. How can I trust anything you say anymore? I shot back, my voice rising. You lied to me for months. You betrayed me. How am I supposed to take your word for it now? She stood up, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Because I'm telling you the truth, she cried. I may have made a horrible mistake, but Emma is your daughter. She's ours. Her words rang hollow to me. Then you shouldn't have a problem proving it, I said. If you're so sure, let's do the test and put this to rest. The argument escalated from there, both of us shouting over each other until Amelia finally broke down in tears. She sank to the floor, sobbing into her hands. I can't believe you're doing this, she whispered. I can't believe you're questioning Emma's paternity. She's your daughter, Slim. She loves you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I refused to back down. If there's nothing to hide, then prove it, I said, my tone softer but no less resolute. The next morning, I scheduled the test. Amelia was furious, accusing me of destroying what little remained of our marriage. But I didn't care. I needed answers. For my own sanity, I needed to know. The wait for the results was agonizing. Every interaction with Emma during those weeks felt strained, my mind unable to quiet the nagging doubt. I hated myself for it, hated the way it made me feel distant from my own child. But the doubt was like a poison, seeping into every part of my life. Amelia and I barely spoke during that time. She was cold and distant, and I could see the resentment in her eyes. She tried to shield the tension from the kids, but they weren't blind. Our eldest, Jamie, started asking questions. Why isn't Mom sleeping in your room anymore? He asked one night as I tucked him in. Sometimes adults need space, I said, dodging the question. But the look on his face told me he didn't buy it. He was only 8, but he was perceptive, too perceptive for his own good. The day the results arrived, my hands trembled as I opened the envelope. The words swam before my eyes, but the conclusion was unmistakable: Emma was mine. The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly overshadowed by a crushing wave of guilt. I had doubted my own child, allowed my anger and mistrust to cloud my judgment. How could I ever repair the damage I'd done? That evening, I showed the results to Amelia. She read them in silence, her expression unreadable. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Was it worth it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Was putting me and Emma through this worth it? I didn't have an answer. I wanted to say yes, that it had brought me peace of mind, but the truth was far messier. The test had answered one question, but it hadn't healed the wound her betrayal had caused. If anything, it had deepened the rift between us. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of Emma's bed, watching her sleep. She looked so peaceful, so innocent. I reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, my heart aching with the weight of what I'd done. She was mine, she had always been mine, and I had let my doubts drive a wedge between us. As I sat there, I realized that the real challenge wasn't the test or the betrayal, it was figuring out how to move forward. Could I ever forgive Amelia? Could we ever rebuild what we had lost? Or was this the beginning of the end for our family? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, I had a lot to make up for, starting with my daughter. The day I asked Amelia to leave was both the hardest and the clearest moment of my life. For weeks after the DNA test came back, confirming Emma was mine, I had wrestled with the decision. My mind ran in endless circles, replaying every argument, every tear, and every attempt to salvage what little was left of our marriage. But in the end, the betrayal was too much. I couldn't see her the same way anymore. I couldn't look at her without remembering Nathan's shadow hanging over us. It started as an ordinary evening, or as ordinary as things had been since the confession. I was sitting at the kitchen table, helping Jamie with his math homework. He was struggling with fractions, his little brow furrowed in concentration. Amelia walked in carrying Emma on her hip. The sight of them together, so natural, so familiar, sent a pang through my chest. For a moment, I wondered if I was making a mistake. But then I remembered the lies, the nights spent wondering where she was, and the way she'd turned our lives upside down with one confession. After dinner, when the kids were tucked in bed, I finally spoke. Amelia was in the living room, folding laundry. I stood in the doorway, my arms crossed, trying to steady my nerves. "We need to talk," I said. She froze, a sock in her hand, and turned to look at me. There was something in her eyes, resignation maybe. She must have known this conversation was coming. She set the sock down and nodded. "Okay," she said softly. I walked into the room and sat on the edge of the couch, leaving a wide space between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. "I can't do this anymore," I said finally. My voice was steady, but inside, I was trembling. "I've tried, Amelia. I've really tried to move past what happened, but I can't. Every time I look at you, I see him. I see the lies. And it's tearing me apart." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. The rejection made her flinch, and she drew her hand back, clutching it to her chest. "Liam, please," she whispered. "We can fix this. I know we can. I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head, the weight of my decision settling heavily on my shoulders. "It's not just about fixing things," I said. "It's about trust, Amelia. And that's gone. I can't trust you anymore. And without that, what do we have?" She started to cry, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I hated seeing her like that, hated the pain I was causing, but I couldn't let that stop me. This wasn't about hurting her, it was about finding a way to heal myself. "I need you to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with shock. "What? No, Liam, please. Don't do this. Think about the kids. Think about Emma and Jamie." "I am thinking about them," I said firmly. "They deserve parents who aren't constantly at each other's throats." They deserve a home that isn't filled with tension and resentment. Staying together for their sake would only hurt them in the long run. She shook her head, her tears falling faster. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to tell them? You can stay with your parents for now, I said. We'll figure out a way to explain this to the kids. Together. But this isn't working anymore, Amelia. You know that as well as I do. For a moment, I thought she might argue, might try to convince me to change my mind. But then she slumped back against the couch, defeated. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded slowly. She said, I'll go. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, watching her pack her things and leave. She took only the essentials, promising to come back for the rest once we figured out a more permanent arrangement. The kids were asleep when she left, so I didn't have to see their confusion or hear their questions. But I knew that moment was coming, and I dreaded it. The house felt emptier without her, but not in the way I'd expected. It wasn't just her absence, it was the weight of what we'd lost, the memories that lingered in every room. I wandered through the house that night, unable to sleep, my thoughts racing. I kept second-guessing myself, wondering if I'd made the right choice, but deep down I knew I had. Staying together would have only prolonged the pain. The next morning, I sat Jamie and Emma down to explain what had happened. Amelia had agreed to let me handle it, though I knew we'd need to have another conversation with them when they saw her again. Mommy's going to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a while, I said, keeping my voice as calm and steady as I could. We both love you very much, and that's not going to change. But sometimes, grown-ups need space to figure things out. Jamie looked confused, his little face scrunched up as he tried to process what I was saying. Are you and Mommy getting a divorce? He asked bluntly. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I glanced at Emma, who was too young to fully understand, and then back at Jamie. I took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, buddy, I said. We are. But that doesn't mean we don't love you and Emma. It just means we're going to be living in different places for a while. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with wide, questioning eyes. I wanted to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I knew that wouldn't make the pain go away. All I could do was be there for him and hope that, in time, he'd understand. Filing for divorce was like driving a nail into the coffin of our marriage. The paperwork was cold and impersonal, a stark contrast to the life we'd shared. I tried to keep things civil with Amelia, for the kids' sake, but every conversation was laced with tension. We argued over custody arrangements, over finances, over who would keep what. Each disagreement felt like another piece of our history being torn apart. The kids split their time between us, and I did my best to make my house feel like a home for them. I took them on weekend outings, cooked their favorite meals, and tried to keep our routines as normal as possible. But it wasn't the same. It never would be. As the weeks turned into months, I began to find a sense of peace in the quiet. I missed the idea of what Amelia and I had been, but I didn't miss the lies, the resentment, or the constant second-guessing. I started going to therapy, trying to make sense of the anger and hurt that still lingered. Slowly, I began to rebuild myself, piece by piece. Amelia and I continued to co-parent, navigating the complicated waters of raising kids after a divorce. There were good days and bad days, moments of civility and moments of bitterness. But through it all, I kept my focus on Jamie and Emma. They were my anchor, my reason to keep moving forward. The divorce was finalized quietly, without fanfare. I signed the papers and walked out of the courthouse feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. The chapter of my life that had been defined by Amelia was officially over. But a new chapter was beginning, one where I could finally start to heal and find myself again. It wasn't the ending I had imagined for us, but it was the one we needed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The moment I received the call from the lab, my world tilted on its axis. I had convinced myself that the worst was behind me, that I'd made peace with Amelia's betrayal and could focus on rebuilding my life and my relationship with the kids. But that phone call changed everything. The technician on the other end of the line confirmed the results of a second DNA test I had requested after the divorce proceedings began. Emma wasn't my biological daughter. My knees buckled, and I sank into the chair in my small office at home. My mind went blank, save for a single, deafening thought. Amelia had lied again. For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at the floor, trying to process what this meant. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Emma, an innocent little girl who believed I was her father. She was my daughter in every way that mattered, except one. I didn't know what to do, who to call, or how to begin unraveling this new web of deceit. That evening, after Jamie and Emma were asleep, I called Amelia. The tension in our conversations had softened somewhat since the divorce, but this time, my anger burned through every word. The DNA test came back, I said, skipping any pretense of small talk. My voice was ice cold, and I could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. What do you mean?" she asked hesitantly. "I had another test done," I said, my hands trembling. "Emma isn't mine, Amelia. She's Nathan's, isn't she?" The silence on the other end stretched for what felt like an eternity. I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, and I knew the answer before she spoke. "Liam." Her voice broke, and she let out a choked sob. "I didn't know for sure. I swear I didn't know." "You didn't know?" I shouted, my voice raw with fury. "You didn't know? How could you not know, Amelia? You had a goddamn affair with him while you were pregnant. I thought she was yours," she cried. "I wanted her to be yours. I didn't want this to happen, Liam. Please, you have to believe me." But I didn't believe her. How could I? She had lied to me for years, let me love and raise a child that wasn't mine without a single word of truth. Her betrayal was complete now, and there was no coming back from it. "Do you know what you've done?" I said, my voice shaking. "You've taken everything from me. My marriage, my trust, my dignity, and now this? Do you even understand what this means for Emma? For me?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But her apology meant nothing. It couldn't undo the years of lies, the bond one had built with Emma, or the devastation she had wrought on our family. I hung up without saying another word, unable to bear the sound of her voice any longer. The anger and heartbreak crashed over me in waves, and I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, trying to make sense of what to do next. The thought of confronting Emma, of explaining this to her, made my chest tighten with panic. She was only 4, too young to understand the complexities of what was happening but old enough to feel the ripple effects of the truth. The next morning, as I sat at the breakfast table with Jamie and Emma, I couldn't help but watch her closely. She was chatting happily about a drawing she'd made at preschool, her face lighting up as she showed it to me. I felt a lump in my throat as I smiled and praised her work, my heart breaking all over again. How could I ever look at her the same way? How could I reconcile the love I felt for her with the knowledge that she wasn't mine? More than that, how could I tell her the truth without destroying her sense of self? I called my therapist later that day, desperate for guidance. She listened patiently as I poured out the story, my voice raw with emotion. When I finished, she let out a soft sigh. "Liam, this is an incredibly difficult situation," she said. "But you need to remember that Emma sees you as her father. Biology doesn't erase the years you've spent loving and raising her. You have every right to be angry, to feel betrayed, but you also have to consider what's best for Emma in the long term." Her words stayed with me as I tried to navigate the days that followed. I avoided Amelia's calls and texts, unable to face her yet. I focused on the kids, trying to keep things as normal as possible for their sake. But the weight of the truth pressed down on me, making every interaction with Emma feel like walking a tightrope. Finally, after a week of avoiding the inevitable, I agreed to meet Amelia in person. We sat across from each other at a coffee shop, the air between us thick with tension. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy and red from crying. "How do we fix this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How do we make this right for Emma?" I shook my head, the bitterness rising in my throat. "There is no fixing this, Amelia. What you've done is unforgivable. But Emma doesn't deserve to suffer for your mistakes. I'm not going to abandon her, but things have to change." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll tell Nathan," she said. "He deserves to know. And Emma, we'll figure out how to tell her when she's older." Hearing Nathan's name made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. Do whatever you want, I said. But don't expect me to play nice with him. He's not stepping into my role as her father. The conversation ended with no clear resolution, just more pain and uncertainty. Amelia left, and I sat there for a long time, staring into my coffee, wondering how my life had come to this. In the weeks that followed, I began to find a strange kind of peace. I threw myself into being the best father I could be for Jamie and Emma, focusing on their happiness above all else. The anger toward Amelia and Nathan didn't fade, but I learned to compartmentalize it, to put it aside for the sake of the kids. Emma remained blissfully unaware of the storm raging around her, and I was determined to keep it that way for as long as possible. She was still my daughter in every way that mattered, and I refused to let Amelia's betrayal take that away from me. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I couldn't yet foresee. But one thing was clear: I would always be there for Emma and Jamie, no matter what. They were my family, my anchor in the chaos, and I wouldn't let anyone take that from me. Not even the truth. News of Amelia's affair with Nathan spread faster than I could have anticipated. I hadn't intended for it to become public knowledge, but small-town whispers have a way of traveling, and it wasn't long before her personal life bled into her professional one. The fallout was as swift as it was brutal. It began with a call from Jamie's teacher. She wanted to let me know that some parents had been talking after school drop-offs. One of them worked at Amelia's firm and mentioned that her relationship with Nathan had come up during a staff meeting. Apparently, someone had overheard Amelia and Nathan arguing at the office about their so-called relationship and shared the details with HR. It didn't take long for rumors to turn into a formal investigation. The next time I saw Amelia, she was visibly shaken. She stood on my porch, her shoulders slumped, a desperate look in her eyes. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside to let her in, though I kept my guard up. We hadn't had many direct conversations since the truth about Emma came out, and every interaction felt like navigating a minefield. She sat on the couch, wringing her hands, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I lost my job," she said finally, her voice trembling. I wasn't surprised, but hearing it aloud still felt surreal. Amelia had always been the consummate professional, the kind of person who thrived under pressure and commanded respect in every room she entered. To see her so defeated was unsettling. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She let out a shaky breath. "They found out about Nathan. Apparently, someone saw us together outside of work months ago and put two and two together after the investigation started. They called me into HR yesterday and told me my behavior was a violation of company policy. They said I jeopardized the firm's reputation." She paused, wiping a tear from her cheek. "They fired me on the spot." Part of me felt sorry for her. After all, losing her job was a heavy blow, but another part couldn't muster much sympathy. Her choices had led to this, and now she was facing the consequences. "What about Nathan?" I asked. "He left the company before any of this came to light," she said bitterly. "He started his own consulting business a few weeks ago. Convenient timing, don't you think?" Her words dripped with resentment, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was starting to see Nathan for who he really was. Not the charming, attentive man who had lured her into an affair, but someone who had used her and moved on when things got messy. "So what now?" I asked. "What's your plan?" She shook her head, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. "I don't know, Liam. I don't know what to do. I've applied to a few places, but it's a small industry. Word travels fast, and everyone knows what happened." Her admission didn't surprise me. Marketing was a tight-knit field, especially in our city, and reputations mattered. Amelia's fall from grace had likely made her a pariah among her peers. "I need your help," she said suddenly, looking up at me with pleading eyes. "I can't do this on my own. Emma needs me, and I don't have anyone else to turn to." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell her that she should have thought about that before she destroyed our family, that her decisions had consequences, and that I wasn't her safety net anymore. But then I thought about Emma. None of this was her fault, and no matter how angry I was at Amelia, I couldn't let Emma suffer because of her mother's mistakes. "I'll help with Emma," I said finally, my voice firm. "But don't think for a second that this means I'm going to bail you out. You made your choices, Amelia, and now you have to live with them. She nodded, her face a mixture of gratitude and shame. Thank you, she whispered. Over the next few weeks, Amelia's situation went from bad to worse. With no income and dwindling savings, she was forced to move in with her parents. It was a humiliating step backward for someone who had always prided herself on her independence, but she had no other option. Emma stayed with me most of the time, which was both a blessing and a challenge. I loved having her around, but every time I looked at her, I was reminded of the mess Amelia had created. Still, I did my best to shield her from the chaos, to give her some semblance of stability in the midst of the storm. Amelia and I maintained a fragile truce, communicating only when necessary and keeping things civil for Emma's sake. She visited on weekends, but the visits were strained. Jamie had grown distant from her, his confusion and hurt manifesting as quiet resentment. Emma, on the other hand, clung to her mother during every visit, blissfully unaware of the tension that simmered beneath the surface. One evening after dropping Emma off at my house, Amelia lingered at the door. She looked thinner, her eyes hollow and tired. Liam, she said hesitantly, do you think I'm a terrible mother? The question caught me off guard. For all her faults, and they were many, I'd never doubted her love for the kids. She'd made catastrophic mistakes, but I could see that she was trying to be there for Emma and Jamie in the ways she still could. I think you've made terrible decisions, I said honestly. But I don't think you're a terrible mother. At least, not to Emma. She flinched at the unspoken implication that she'd failed Jamie, and I didn't soften the blow. He was struggling because of her, and she needed to face that. I'm trying, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just don't know if it'll ever be enough. That's something only time will tell, I said, and with that I closed the door. Watching her walk away, I felt a strange mix of pity and relief. Pity for the person she'd become, and relief that I was no longer tied to her chaos. My focus was on Jamie and Emma now, on giving them the stability they deserved and moving forward one step at a time. Amelia would have to find her own way, just like I had.